Two world leaders just told the public two completely different stories about the same negotiation on the same day, and neither one appears to be lying exactly. That contradiction alone would be strange enough to build an entire documentary around. But a few hours after those two statements went public, a ship burned in the water where the negotiation is supposedly happening, and one of its crew members is still missing. When the diplomacy and the violence contradict each other this directly, in real time, it usually means you're looking at the wrong negotiation entirely. Here's what was said. First, President Trump told the public that negotiations with Iran were underway, that they could be resolved within days, and that this represented Tehran's last chance to end the conflict before facing severe consequences. His Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, echoed that same optimism just a day later, saying he hoped a deal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz could be finalized within 24 to 48 hours. From Washington, the message was clear and consistent: real talks, real progress, real deadline. From Tehran, the response was just as clear, and it flatly contradicted almost everything Washington was saying. Iranian officials stated there were no direct negotiations taking place with the United States at all. Instead, they said Iran was negotiating exclusively with one country, Oman, not Washington, not through Washington, directly with Muscat, over a specific, narrow question that has nothing to do with broader peace terms and everything to do with a single practical problem: how ships are supposed to move safely through 60 miles of water that both countries border. This isn't the kind of contradiction where each side is simply spinning the same set of facts to sound better in front of their own domestic audience. This is two governments describing entirely different processes with different participants aimed at different outcomes. And that gap in the story is exactly where this documentary needs to spend its time, because the real explanation for who's telling the truth turns out to be more interesting than either version alone. But before untangling that, you need to understand what was happening on the water while these statements were being made, because it's the part of this story that can't be spun, denied, or reframed by either government. In the 5 days leading up to Trump's last chance comment, the waters near Oman's Musandam Peninsula, the narrowest, most dangerous stretch of the Strait of Hormuz, recorded 4 separate maritime security incidents. 2 tankers, the Egypt Prosperity and the On Pride, reported explosions and warning shots in Omani territorial waters without sustaining serious damage. Then, on the night of August 3rd, a Liberian-flagged bulk carrier called the Minoan Pioneer, a Greek-operated vessel roughly the length of 2 football fields, was struck by an unidentified projectile roughly 20 nautical miles northeast of the Omani town of Kasab. The projectile hit the engine room directly, causing a complete blackout and sparking a fire that spread into the crew's living quarters. The crew fought the blaze as long as they could before being forced to abandon ship. As of this recording, one crew member, the vessel's 3rd engineer, remains unaccounted for. No group has claimed responsibility. It's worth stepping back and asking why the Malacca comparison keeps surfacing in this story, because it isn't a random reference point, it's doing real analytical work. The Strait of Malacca arrangement wasn't built during a war. It emerged gradually, over years of cooperative planning between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, specifically to fund navigation aids, environmental cleanup, and search and rescue capacity in a waterway all 3 nations depend on, and none of them fully control alone. It's held up for decades precisely because it was voluntary, modest, and cooperative rather than coercive. Applying that same label to a framework being negotiated in the middle of an active war, under the direct threat of continued Iranian attacks on shipping, stretches the comparison close to its breaking point. A voluntary contribution scheme negotiated in peacetime among trusted neighbors is a fundamentally different animal from a fee structure being negotiated by a combatant state that has spent the last 5 months demonstrating, repeatedly and violently, exactly what happens to ships that don't cooperate. Whether the final Hormuz arrangement resembles Malacca in substance or simply borrows its name to make a much more coercive framework sound more palatable to international shipping and insurance markets, may end up being one of the more consequential distinctions buried inside all this diplomatic language. There's also a financial dimension to this story worth making concrete, because the numbers involved aren't small. Reports on Iran's fee proposals have ranged from a headline figure of roughly $1 million per vessel down to more selectively applied charges, reportedly reaching around $2 million for certain ships, described by shipping analysts as arbitrary rather than governed by any consistent published tariff schedule. For context, the Strait carries something in the range of 21 million barrels of oil every day in ordinary times, close to a fifth of everything the world consumes, moved by a rotating fleet of tankers that before this war could expect to pass through free of any transit charge at all under long-standing international navigation law. Even a modest, selectively applied fee on a fraction of that traffic would generate a meaningful, recurring revenue stream for whichever governments end up administering it, which helps explain why Tehran, in the middle of a war that has already cost it enormously in both economic and human terms, has been willing to make control over exactly this mechanism its central diplomatic priority rather than a secondary bargaining chip. Sit with that sequence for a second, because it matters. This didn't happen during a lull in the diplomatic process. It happened in the same news cycle as Trump's announcement of imminent progress and Bessent's 48-hour prediction. Shipping through the strait, which used to see roughly 100 vessels a day before this war began, has collapsed to a fraction of that, with some days seeing only a handful of ships willing to risk the crossing at all. Whatever is actually being negotiated, it clearly hasn't produced enough confidence on the water to matter yet, and possibly hasn't produced any real change in the underlying risk at all. There's also a ticking clock buried inside this story that makes the current standoff even more urgent than it might first appear. Back in mid-June, when Presidents Trump and Pezeshkian signed the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, one of its provisions established a 60-day window during which transit through the strait would remain toll-free, a kind of grace period meant to let normal shipping patterns stabilize before anyone started discussing fees at all. That window is now closing, with roughly 19 days remaining as of the most recent reporting. That deadline puts real pressure on every party at the table, because if no agreement is finalized before it expires, the toll-free provision simply lapses, potentially leaving Iran free to impose charges unilaterally without any negotiated framework governing how much, on whom, or with what portions shared with Oman. That's part of why Bessent's 48-hour timeline and Trump's language about a last chance carry more urgency than ordinary diplomatic optimism. There's an actual expiration date attached to the current legal status of the strait, and every day that passes without a finalized framework increases the odds that whatever emerges afterward gets negotiated under even more chaotic ad hoc conditions than the ones producing today's headlines. It's also worth remembering just how fragile every previous version of this ceasefire process has already proven to be, because that history should temper anyone's confidence that this round of talks, however close to completion it appears, will actually hold. Since the war began in February, the ceasefire between the United States and Iran has broken down and been reconstructed at least 3 separate times, each collapse triggered by a different flashpoint. Disputed interpretations of the original agreement's terms, renewed strikes on Iranian military infrastructure, retaliatory attacks on Gulf shipping. There is no obvious reason to assume the current diplomatic momentum around Hormuz is structurally different from the momentum that preceded each of those earlier collapses, and the string of unclaimed attacks near Musandam over the past week is, if anything, a fairly direct echo of the pattern that has preceded every previous ceasefire failure in this war. Optimism from officials in Washington and Tehran has so far been a consistently unreliable predictor of what actually happens on the water in the days that follow. So here's the question worth actually chasing. If Iran says it isn't talking to the United States, and the United States says a deal could close within days, who exactly is Trump negotiating with? The most plausible answer, based on the reporting that's emerged over the past 2 weeks, is that both statements might be technically accurate, describing 2 different, only loosely connected tracks running in parallel. Iran and Oman appear to be negotiating directly and substantively over the operational mechanics of reopening the strait, who controls which shipping lane, whether fees get charged and to whom, how vessels get cleared to pass. The United States, meanwhile, appears to be engaged in a separate, more indirect channel, one that may run through intermediaries, that touches on the broader question of ending hostilities and lifting the naval blockade, without necessarily being the venue where the actual granular terms of Hormuz's reopening get decided. If that reading is correct, then Trump and Tehran aren't really contradicting each other about the same negotiation, so much as each describing the piece of a much larger, multi-track process that's most flattering to their own position, while conveniently leaving out the piece that isn't. That distinction, if it holds up, is the real story here, and it's a much bigger one than a simple he said, they said dispute. Because if the actual operational control over the Strait of Hormuz is being negotiated directly between Iran and Oman, with the United States present only at the margins, then Washington may be in the process of claiming credit for an outcome it isn't actually the primary author of. To understand how this bilateral track between Tehran and Muscat got so far along, you have to go back roughly 2 weeks to when Oman first floated a proposal explicitly modeled on the arrangement that governs the Strait of Malacca, the equally critical choke point between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, managed jointly by Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. Under that model, ships transiting the strait are asked, not required, to make voluntary financial contributions that fund navigation safety, environmental protection, and search and rescue services. A system that raises relatively modest revenue, but avoids the appearance of a coastal state charging mandatory tolls for passage through what international law generally treats as open transit water. Oman's initial pitch to Iran followed roughly that logic. A route split evenly between Iranian and Omani territorial waters, with ships entering through Iran's side and exiting through Oman's, funded by contributions from shipping companies rather than fixed, compulsory fees. Iran's deputy foreign minister, Kazem Garibabadi, said publicly that this proposal simply didn't go far enough to address Tehran's underlying concern, which isn't really about revenue at all, it's about control. According to reporting from Al Jazeera and other outlets tracking the talks closely, Iran's counterproposal asked for something considerably more sweeping. Both shipping lanes running through Iranian territorial waters, not split with Oman, along with a formal service fee reportedly as high as $1 million per vessel, an order of magnitude beyond anything the voluntary Malacca-style model would ever generate. For a brief period, talks appeared to stall entirely over that gap, with analysts at institutions like the Institute for the Study of War describing Iranian control over the strait as Tehran's central strategic objective in this entire phase of the war, arguably more important to Iranian leadership than any single battlefield outcome. Then, within the space of about a week, the picture shifted again. According to reporting from the New York Times and corroborated by regional sources, Iran and Oman began moving toward a version of the deal that splits the difference in a specific, telling way. Ships entering the Persian Gulf would cross through a route close to Iran's coast, controlled by Iran, while ships leaving would use a separate route closer to Oman's coast. Vessels would pay service fees, with the revenue split evenly between Tehran and Muscat. That arrangement, if finalized, hands Iran meaningful, structural control over the inbound lanes specifically, the direction carrying the empty tankers headed toward Gulf oil terminals to load crude, while offering Oman enough of a role and enough revenue to make the arrangement politically palatable as a jointly managed corridor rather than unilateral Iranian control. This is the detail worth sitting with, because it's the actual hidden story sitting underneath the louder, more confusing headlines about who's negotiating with whom. If this framework holds, Iran doesn't just end the war with the Strait of Hormuz reopened, it ends the war having converted what began as a purely military choke point, closed by force during an active conflict, into something closer to a permanent, revenue-generating administrative institution, co-managed with a neutral Gulf neighbor, collecting fees on a portion of the world's oil trade indefinitely. That's a genuinely different outcome than simply restoring the pre-war status quo. Before this war, ships moved through Hormuz as a matter of customary international navigation rights, under a regime where coastal states generally couldn't charge tolls just for transit. If Iran and Oman successfully institutionalize a fee-based, jointly administered corridor, they will have used 5 months of war to fundamentally renegotiate the legal character of one of the world's most important waterways, permanently, not just for the duration of the conflict. It's worth pausing here to give real weight to the strongest counter-argument to this framing, because it's not a fringe position, it's shared by serious analysts and by Oman's own government. Oman's foreign minister has publicly and specifically rejected the idea of mandatory fees, insisting the country supports only the voluntary Malacca-style model and drawing a clear line between that and anything resembling a toll. It's entirely possible that what's being reported as a near-final deal is actually still a live negotiation with substantial daylight between Iran's maximalist position and what Oman, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the international shipping industry are actually willing to accept in the end. The Institute for the Study of War's own analysis notes that Iran's stated demand for control over both lanes is something neither Gulf states, the United States, the International Maritime Organization, nor the shipping industry broadly has shown any willingness to accept, precisely because formally recognizing that kind of coastal state control would set a legal precedent far beyond Hormuz itself, one that could embolden other states bordering other choke points to attempt something similar. If that resistance holds, this specific plan could collapse the way Iran's more extreme demands already have once before, and markets could simply go back to treating the strait as ordinary, ungoverned geography once the war ends, exactly as they did before February. But even skeptics of the maximalist version of this story tend to agree on the underlying trend line, and it's worth stating plainly, because it may be the single most important sentence in this entire documentary. Multiple serious actors, Iran, Oman, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and reportedly even the United States itself, have now spent real diplomatic capital negotiating some version of a fee and permission structure for a waterway that 18 months ago nobody would have described as negotiable at all. Whether the final arrangement ends up closer to Oman's modest voluntary contribution model or Iran's more assertive dual-lane control scheme, the strait has already been rehearsed, publicly and repeatedly, as a service with a price attached rather than as a simple geographic fact. That shift in itself may prove durable regardless of exactly where the final numbers land, and there's reporting to suggest President Trump himself has shown some openness to that shift, at one point describing the possibility of the United States joining Iran in a joint venture over strait fees as, in his words, a way of securing the waterway from other threats as well. That comment deserves its own moment of attention because it complicates the simple narrative of America being cut out of the process entirely. If Trump is genuinely open to some version of a joint American-Iranian arrangement around fees and security, then Washington isn't just a bystander watching Tehran and Muscat carve up control of the strait without it. It may be angling for its own seat at a table it wasn't originally invited to, using its broader leverage over the conflict's endgame, the blockade, the sanctions, the terms of any final ceasefire, to insert itself into an arrangement that started as a purely regional, bilateral conversation. Whether that effort succeeds, and whether it happens through the direct U.S.-Iran channel Trump described or through pressure applied to Oman instead, is simply not yet knowable from the outside. But it does suggest that Trump's public optimism about an imminent deal may not be pure overstatement. It may reflect a real, if less central, American stake in an outcome that Iran and Oman are nonetheless the primary authors of. Which brings the story back to that burning ship off the coast of Kasab, because it's worth asking directly why an attack like that would happen at exactly this moment, in the middle of what multiple parties describe as active, potentially near-final negotiations. One interpretation, offered by several maritime security analysts, is that the timing is simply coincidental, a consequence of an already chaotic, under-monitored war zone where unclaimed attacks from unclear origins have become a near-daily occurrence regardless of whatever diplomatic track happens to be active that week. Another interpretation, harder to prove but impossible to rule out, is that the attack reflects exactly the kind of leverage-building violence that tends to accompany high-stakes negotiations over control of contested territory, a reminder from whichever actor is responsible that formal agreements on paper mean very little if the underlying security situation on the water remains this unstable. It's possible the Minoan Pioneer was struck for reasons that have nothing to do with the Iran-Oman talks at all. It's also possible it's a direct message aimed at exactly that process. Neither can be confirmed from the available evidence, and any documentary claiming certainty here would be overstating what's actually known. What can be said clearly is this: the missing crew member, the burned engine room, and the abandoned ship are not abstractions in this story. They're the actual physical cost of a strait that remains this contested, this violent, and this unresolved, no matter how close the diplomatic language suggests a resolution might be. 4 maritime security incidents in 5 days is not the signature of a waterway on the verge of calm, orderly reopening. It's the signature of a choke point where the diplomatic process and the physical reality on the water are, for now, still moving on 2 entirely separate timelines, one measured in press statements and draft proposals, the other measured in blackouts, fires, and missing sailors. So where does that leave the honest answer to the question this entire story keeps circling? Who actually controls the Strait of Hormuz once this war finally ends? Based on everything visible right now, the most likely answer isn't the United States, and it isn't a return to the pre-war arrangement where the strait functioned as open, ungoverned transit water either. The most likely answer, still contingent and still being negotiated in real time, is some version of Iran and Oman jointly, with Iran holding the more consequential lane and the larger share of structural leverage, and with Washington working, from somewhat outside that core bilateral relationship, to claim credit for the outcome and possibly secure its own stake in whatever revenue or security arrangement eventually emerges. The real question, then, isn't simply which government is telling the truth about who's negotiating with whom, or even whether the next round of talks finally produces a durable working framework. The real question is what it means for the future of global shipping when one of the world's most important waterways stops being a fact of geography and starts being a piece of contested revenue-generating infrastructure, permanently up for negotiation between whichever regional powers happen to border it. Because if Hormuz becomes the precedent, the strait where a war finally proved that control over a choke point can be renegotiated by force and then formalized through diplomacy, the next country sitting beside its own narrow, critical waterway will be watching this outcome very closely and drawing its own conclusions about what's actually possible the next time it decides its geography is worth more than the rules currently say it is.